In the autumn of 1853, on a decaying sugar plantation situated 40 miles south of Baton Rouge, an enslaved housemaid named Celestine received an order to enter her mistress's bedchamber and secure the door from within. She did not emerge for 11 days. When the overseer finally forced the lock on the morning of November 14th, what he discovered inside that shuttered room was so unspeakable that the family paid the parish sheriff $600 in silver to incinerate every document pertaining to the estate of Madame Honorine Thibodeaux. Yet 3 pages endured. They had been concealed within the lining of a slave's apron and carried beyond the back gate of Bellefontaine before sunrise. I have devoted 4 years to tracing the journey of those pages, and what they contain fundamentally revises everything we thought we understood about how wealth was transmitted in the final years of the old French plantation system in Louisiana. Before we proceed with the narrative of Bellefontaine and the events that transpired inside Madame Thibodeaux's bedchamber, kindly take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Activate the notification bell so you won't miss our forthcoming investigation. And let me know in the comments which state or city you are joining us from right now. I am curious to learn how far this story is reaching tonight. Now allow me to transport you back. Transport you to a river parish where the Spanish moss hung so densely from the live oaks that it muffled all sound, where the sugar boilers operated ceaselessly from October through January, and where a single family, the Thibodeaux, had possessed the same 720 arpents of bottomland since 1741. Bellefontaine was not the largest plantation in the parish, but it was the most ancient. The main house had been constructed in the French colonial manner, elevated on brick piers to guard against the Mississippi's floods. Its wrap around gallery was shaded by 6 enormous oaks, planted by the founder, Armand Thibodeaux, over a century before our narrative commences. The walls were of cypress. The floors were heart pine so dark they appeared nearly black. And by the time Madame Honorine Thibodeaux took to her bed in the spring of 1853, the house had outlived 3 generations of the family that had erected it. She was the final survivor. Her husband, Leopold, had succumbed to yellow fever 15 years earlier. Her 3 sons had each died young, 2 in infancy, and the third, her beloved Pascal, at age 19 in a duel over a gambling debt in New Orleans. She had 1 surviving child, a daughter named Odette, who had married a merchant from St. Louis and who had not set foot on Bellefontaine in over a decade. Honorine was 73 years old in the autumn of 53. She weighed less than 90 pounds. Her left side had gone slack following what the parish doctor termed a minor stroke the previous winter, and she could no longer walk unaided. But her mind, the house servants asserted, was sharper than it had ever been. And her cruelty, which had always been formidable, had sharpened to a single obsessive point. She would not permit Odette to inherit Bellefontaine. The household at Bellefontaine in the autumn of 53 consisted of the following: Madame Honorine herself, confined to the large corner bedchamber on the 2nd floor that overlooked the back gardens. Her nephew, Arsène Pontalba, 34 years old, unmarried, who had arrived from New Orleans 3 years earlier, ostensibly to assist in managing the estate, and who had not departed. An overseer named Bertrand Sicard, a Cajun from the Atchafalaya Basin, coarse in manner but meticulous in his work. A Creole housekeeper named Madame Voisin, born free in Saint-Domingue, who had come to the plantation as a girl following the uprising, and who had served the Thibodeaux family for 51 years, and 47 enslaved men, women, and children, of whom 9 worked inside the house and the remainder in the cane fields and the sugar mill. Of the 9 house slaves, one name will concern us above all others: Celestine, She was 26 years old. She had been born on Bellefontaine. Her mother, a seamstress called Philom, had been Honorine's personal maid for 30 years, before succumbing to consumption in the winter of 51. After her mother's death, Celestine had been promoted from the laundry and assigned to serve Madame Thibaudox directly. She was, by every account I have managed to recover, a quiet woman, tall for her era, nearly 5'9", literate in French, which her mother had secretly taught her against the law, steady-handed, and according to the testimony of Madame Voisin, given many years later to a Freedmen's Bureau officer in 1867, she possessed an unusual capacity to endure without complaint. Madame Voisin termed it in Creole French, une patience terrible, a terrible patience. But the housekeeper intended it as praise. She would later come to mean it as something else entirely. To comprehend what Bellefontaine smelled and sounded like in the autumn of 53, you must grasp the sugar parish in that season. The harvest in Louisiana commences in October and continues until Christmas. Every plantation for 40 miles along the river was burning cane trash and boiling syrup simultaneously, and the air from mid-October onward was dense with a sweetness so heavy it coated the back of the throat and refused to dissipate. At night, from the upper gallery of any big house, you could perceive the orange glow of a dozen sugar houses along the river, each a smudge of light beneath a column of smoke that did not rise because the air was too stagnant. The fields themselves were cut in sections, with the standing cane towering over the men who entered them with long curved knives at 4 in the morning, and who did not re-emerge until the sun had set again. The slaves labored in gangs under the direction of drivers, the cane stalks falling in rows, the wagons hauling them to the mill, the rollers of the mill crushing them for the juice moving through a series of open copper kettles in which it was reduced and purified and finally granulated. The work did not cease. The fire beneath the kettles did not go out from October to December. The men who tended the boilers slept in 4-hour shifts, and half of them were dead from accidents, exhaustion, or pneumonia by the time they reached 40 years of age. This was the system Bellefontaine had operated, unaltered in its essentials since 1741, and the only thing that changed from generation to generation was the names of the people who tended it and the slow refinement of the cruelty required to keep it functioning. By 1853, the plantation was producing roughly 400 hogsheads of sugar annually at prices that fluctuated between 5 and 9 cents a pound on the New Orleans market. In a good year, it generated an income of perhaps $30,000. In a bad year, it produced nothing and had to be sustained on credit from the factors on Gravier Street. The existing will of Madame Honorine, the one drafted in 1841 after her husband's death, valued the estate as a whole, including the land, the buildings, the machinery, and the 47 enslaved persons, at somewhere between $120,000 and $150,000. In 1853, that was the equivalent of several $1 million in modern currency. It was, in other words, a fortune. And it was that fortune and the century of accumulated blood that had produced it that Madame Honorine was preparing to weaponize against her daughter in the final weeks of her life. Madame Voisin deserves a second paragraph. She was 63 years old in the autumn of 53. She had been born in Dreux-les-Mines on the southern coast of what was then the French colony of Saint-Domingue, to a free woman of color who operated a small dressmaking business. She was 12 years old in the summer of 1803 when her mother placed her aboard a schooner bound for New Orleans with 240 other refugees, fleeing the final collapse of the French colonial regime. She had arrived in Louisiana with nothing. She had been taken into the Thibodeau's household at age 14 as a kitchen helper under an arrangement whose details have been lost to the record. And she had risen over 5 decades to become, in all but title, the manager of the house. She had witnessed Leopold Thibodeau's death. She had delivered 2 of Madame Honorine's children. She had laid out the bodies of both infants on the dining room table for the family to mourn. She had watched Pascal Thibodeau grow from a thoughtful boy into a reckless young man and had not been surprised, although she had been deeply grieved when the news returned from New Orleans that he had been killed in the duel. She had known Odette from birth. She had known Celestine from birth. She understood everything unfolding in the autumn of '53 because she had spent 50 years observing the family that owned her for wages prepare this moment without realizing they were preparing it. And she had decided, though she had not yet told anyone, that she would not permit the old woman upstairs to complete her work. Bertrand Sickard, the overseer, was 39 years old. He was the son of Acadian fishermen from the Atchafalaya Basin. Poorly educated, capable, violent when required, not sadistic by the standards of his profession, and loyal to whoever paid his wages. He had labored at Bellefontaine for 9 years. He knew the cane fields better than any man on the plantation. He did not like Arsène Pontalba. He respected Madame Honorine in the manner a man respects a dangerous animal. And he had, over the previous summer, begun to privately wonder whether he should seek employment elsewhere, because he could sense, without being able to articulate it, that something at Bellefontaine was drawing to a close. The sugar harvest of '53 was intended to be the most lucrative in 20 years. Prices in New Orleans were robust. The rains had arrived at the appropriate times. The cane stood 11 feet high by mid-October, and the mill was scheduled to commence rolling on the 24th. But on the afternoon of October 12th, an event occurred at Bellefontaine that would eventually draw the parish sheriff, a notary from Baton Rouge, a Catholic priest from Donaldsonville, and finally a team of men with shovels to a place in the back garden where nothing was supposed to be buried. That afternoon, Madame Honorine summoned her nephew Arsène to her bedchamber. She had been refusing to see him for 8 days. When he arrived, she was sitting upright against her pillows, which was itself unusual, and she held in her lap a sealed leather portfolio that Madame Voisin would later identify as the one in which Leopold Thibodeau had kept his most important private papers and which had not been opened since his death. Arsène emerged from the bedchamber 40 minutes later. He was, according to the kitchen girl who spotted him on the back stairs, white as linen. He went directly to the stables. He ordered his horse saddled. Then he rode to Donaldsonville and did not return for 3 days. On the afternoon of October 15th, Arsène returned with a notary. The notary was a man named Auguste Delacroix, 61 years old, known throughout the parish as a meticulous drafter of wills and acts of donation. He carried a leather satchel and a case of writing instruments. He was shown directly to Madame Honorine's bedchamber, where he remained for 2 hours. When he came out, Madame Voisin asked him in the corridor whether Madame was intending to revise her testament. The notary gazed at the housekeeper for a long moment. Then he said, in careful French, that what Madame Thibodeau was planning was not a revision. He descended the stairs without further explanation and rode back to Donaldsonville. That evening, Celestine was summoned upstairs. She had served Madame's dinner in the bedchamber every evening for 2 years. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the instruction she received upon entering. Madame Honorine, propped against her pillows by the bolsters her housemaid had arranged that morning, told Celestine to set down the tray and to close the door. Celestine closed the door. Then Madame Honorine told her to turn the key in the lock. Celestine turned the key. Then Madame Honorine, in a voice so low that Celestine had to step closer to the bed to hear it, instructed the young woman that she was to remain in that room, not leaving for any reason except to empty the chamber pot in the adjoining closet, and that Madame Voisin would bring food to the door at intervals, but would not be permitted to enter. Celestine was to sleep on the small daybed at the foot of Madame's own bed. She was not to speak to anyone through the door. She was not to pass any object out of the room, and if anyone, including Monsieur Arseny, attempted to enter, Celestine was to refuse. Celestine, who was 26 years old, and who had been owned by this family her entire life, who had watched her mother die in a drafty room behind the kitchen, because Madame Honorine would not permit a doctor to be called for a slave, said nothing. She set down the tray. She turned back to the door. She locked it, and for 11 days she did not come out. It would be tempting at this juncture to leap ahead to the morning of November 14th, and to what the overseer discovered when he broke the lock. I will not do that yet, because what matters most about Bellefontaine in the autumn of '53 is not what was found inside that room at the end. It is what was being done inside that room during those 11 days. And to grasp that, we must understand what Madame Honorine Thibodeaux was willing to destroy in order to protect her hatred of her only surviving daughter. Odette Thibodeaux had married at age 19 a St. Louis merchant named Hyacinthe Cailloux. Hyacinthe was American by then, though his family was of French descent from the upper Mississippi. He was a commission merchant in the river trade, respectable, prosperous, a Catholic. By every reasonable measure, he was an acceptable match for the daughter of a Louisiana planter. But Madame Honorine had never forgiven him for one thing. At the wedding dinner at Bellefontaine, Hyacinthe Cailloux had made a remark in the presence of 14 guests, including the priest and the parish judge, to the effect that the days of the plantation system were numbered, and that a man of vision would prepare to diversify his wealth into northern manufactures and St. Louis real estate. He had meant it kindly, as advice to his new mother-in-law, whose husband had recently died, and whose estate he worried might not survive the coming decades unaltered. Honorine had interpreted it as an attack on everything her family had built for 100 years. She had heard it as a prediction of her defeat, and she had commenced, from that night forward, to plan how Odette and Hyacinthe Cailloux would never inherit one arpent of Bellefontaine. By the laws of Louisiana, this was not simple. Louisiana, alone among the states, retained the Napoleonic Code, and with it the doctrine of forced heirship. A parent could not simply disinherit a child. A portion of the estate, called the legitime, was reserved to the children by operation of law, and no will or act of donation could defeat it. If Odette was Madame Honorine's only surviving child, Odette was entitled, by the black letter of the law, to 3/4 of the succession. Honorine could give the remaining quarter, called the disposable portion, to whomever she pleased. But Odette's 3/4 she could not touch, not by will, not by sale on favorable terms to a nephew, not by any ordinary act, unless Madame Honorine could prove, by documentary evidence filed before a notary, that Odette had committed against her mother one of the specific acts recognized by Article 1521 of the Civil Code as grounds for disinheritance. There were 10 such grounds in Louisiana in 1853, and they included striking a parent. They included attempting to take a parent's life. They included refusing to ransom a parent held captive. Most of them required physical acts committed under specific witnessed circumstances. They were, in practice, almost impossible to prove, except the 9th, The ninth ground for disinheritance under the Civil Code of 1825, as it stood in Louisiana in the autumn of '53, was this: a child who had refused food to a parent in necessity could be disinherited by the parent if the fact was established in authentic form before a notary and 2 witnesses, and if the act of disinheritance specified the cause, and if the cause was sworn to by the parent in writing under oath, while of sound mind. Madame Honorine Thibodeaux intended to swear in writing under oath before the notary Auguste Delacroix that her daughter Odette had refused to send her during the previous winter of her illness the remittances Odette had promised. She intended to swear that she had written 3 letters to Odette requesting assistance, and that none had been answered. She intended to produce those letters, or copies of them, in her own hand, and to produce also the drafts she claimed she had mailed and which she claimed her daughter had never acknowledged. She intended, in short, to fabricate in the intimacy of her locked bedchamber the documentary record of a crime that had never occurred. And she intended that Celestine, the only person in the house who was to remain in the room with her, should be the physical instrument of that fabrication, because Madame Honorine's left hand was now useless and her right hand had begun to tremble so badly in the previous month that she could no longer form her own letters with any consistency. She needed someone who could write, someone who could imitate her handwriting under her close supervision, someone who could not testify, someone whose presence in the room could be concealed, whose absence from her normal duties could be explained by illness, and whose silence could be guaranteed by ownership. She needed Celestine. Before we proceed further into what occurred in that locked room, I want to pose a question to you. Pause for a moment and consider it. In a society that held human beings as property, that forbade the enslaved to read or write, that stripped them of every legal recognition as persons, what does it signify that the entire machinery of that society's inheritance, its wealth, its generational continuity, its carefully constructed legal fictions, could come to depend on the hand of a 26-year-old woman who had been taught to read in secret by her dying mother? If you are finding this story as unsettling as I found the documents that reveal it, please hit the like button right now. It genuinely assists the channel in reaching more people who care about the forgotten corners of American history. Let me know in the comments what you think Celestine did. Madame Voisin was the first to perceive that something was amiss. On the morning of October 13th, she brought a breakfast tray to the bedchamber door, as instructed. The door opened only far enough for Celestine's hand to emerge and take the tray. The housekeeper caught a glimpse of the room beyond. She saw Madame Honorine seated at a small writing desk that had been moved from the window to the side of the bed. She saw papers. She saw an inkwell. She saw Celestine standing behind Madame's chair with her hand. Madame Voisin later insisted, guiding Madame's hand across a sheet of paper. The carriage halted here. Then the door closed. I believe you are mistaken. That evening Madame Voisin went to Arseny. She informed him of what she had seen. Arseny was drunk, which was his condition most evenings by that point in the year. He listened. He said that his aunt was entitled to the privacy of her own bedchamber. He said the housekeeper should mind her own affairs. He said that if Madame Voisin valued her position, she would not mention this to anyone else in the house. Then he poured himself another glass of brandy. But Arseny was not as indifferent as he pretended. That same night, after Madame Voisin had retired to her own quarters, he walked up the stairs and stood outside his aunt's bedchamber for a long time. He heard from within the sound of his aunt's voice speaking in the low, continuous murmur of dictation. He heard the sound of a pen scratching against paper. He did not hear Celestine's voice at all. He went back down the stairs. He wrote a letter to the notary Delacroix in Donaldsonville. He gave the letter to the stable boy with instructions to ride before dawn, and then he began to wait. What Arseny desired in the autumn of '53 was somewhat more complicated than it appeared. He was Madame Honorine's nearest male relative after her daughter. He was a Pontalba on his mother's side, a Thibodeaux by blood through his grandfather. He had come to Bellefontaine in the spring of '50 because he had gambled away his own inheritance in the New Orleans faro houses, and he had nowhere else to go. His aunt had taken him in reluctantly. She had given him the north guest room and an allowance of $40 a month. She had made clear repeatedly in his presence, and in the presence of others, that he would inherit nothing. The estate was to go 3 quarters to Odette by forced heirship and 1 quarter by will to the Catholic Diocese of New Orleans for the maintenance of a charity hospital. The diocese, not Arseny, not 1 picayune to Arseny, but in the last 2 years, something had shifted. Madame Honorine's health had collapsed. Her hatred of her daughter had grown into something monstrous. And Arseny had begun to understand that, if he was patient, if he was useful, if he was present when the notary came, he might find himself named in the New Testament for a larger share than the disposable quarter would ordinarily suggest. He had in fact believed until October 12th that this was what was happening. He had believed that his aunt was making him her residuary legatee, that she would use her disposable portion to give him everything she legally could, and that he would manage the remaining 3 quarters on Odette's behalf as executor for years, perhaps decades. But what he had heard in his aunt's bedchamber on October 12th, when he had been summoned and shown the sealed leather portfolio, was something else entirely. His aunt had informed him that she intended to disinherit Odette altogether, completely by sworn affidavit under Article 1521, or as she had told him, she would then leave the entire estate. Every arpent, every slave, every stick of furniture, by New Testament to 2 parties jointly himself, Arseny Pontalba to receive 1/2, and the Diocese of New Orleans to receive the other half in trust for a foundation in the name of her dead son Pascal. Half of Bellefontaine, half of 720 arpents of sugar land, half of 47 slaves, half of the house itself, the oldest French colonial house in the parish with its cypress walls and its heart pine floors and its 6 enormous oaks. It was more than Arseny had ever dreamed, and he had walked out of that bedchamber on October 12th white as linen. Not because he was horrified. He had walked out white as linen because he understood at last that he had become necessary to his aunt's revenge, and because he understood that revenge would make him rich, and because some part of him, the part that still remembered being a boy and being held by his aunt on the gallery at Bellefontaine on a summer evening 30 years before, recoiled at what he was about to help his aunt do to his only cousin. He recoiled, and then he wrote to Donaldsonville, and he brought back the notary. The notary, Auguste Delacroix, deserves a paragraph of his own. He was not a bad man. He was, by the standards of his time and profession, a conscientious one. He had drafted testaments for 40 years in the river parishes, and he had witnessed every variety of family cruelty that wealth can breed. He knew when he arrived at Bellefontaine on October 15th what Madame Honorine was proposing. He had received her preliminary letter the week before. He had read Article 1521 3 times on the ride to the plantation, and he had made before he dismounted in the oak alley a private decision. He would take Madame's declarations. He would record them. He would take the evidence she presented. But he would not certify the act of disinheritance until he had personally written to Odette Caylux in St. Louis and given her the opportunity to respond. This was not required by law. Under the code, the parent's sworn statement before the notary and 2 witnesses was sufficient. But Delacroix had his own conscience, and he had filed away in the sitting room of his office in Donaldsonville 3 letters from Odette Caylux written over the previous 18 months to the parish priest of Donaldsonville, inquiring after her mother's health and enclosing remittances in cash to be used for her mother's care at the priest's discretion, since the mother had refused to correspond directly. Delacroix knew, in other words, that Madame Honorine's claim was false. He did not yet know how he would act on that knowledge. But he had decided, riding through the Oak Alley on October 15th, that he would not act against it either. He spent 2 hours in the bedchamber. He took down, in his notary's precise script, the sworn declarations Madame Honorine dictated to him. He noted in his private journal that Madame's declarations were supported by what she called copies of her letters and of letters allegedly sent by her daughter, and that these documents, he observed with interest, all appeared to be written in the same hand, namely Madame Honorine's own. He noted that the copies of Odette's alleged letters contained, in their phrasing, several Louisiana French idioms that Odette, having lived in St. Louis for a decade and having written her mother in English for years, would have been unlikely to use. He noted that Madame Honorine was dictating her declarations in a voice that was, though weak, entirely lucid, and that she appeared to be of sound mind within the legal meaning of that term. He noted all of this, and then he took the documents Madame Honorine handed him, sealed them in a leather satchel, placed them in the locked chest bolted to the floor of his office the next day, and wrote, that same evening, a letter to Odette Caylux in St. Louis, telling her nothing specific, but requesting that she come immediately to Louisiana on a matter concerning her mother's estate. That letter would not reach St. Louis until November 2nd. Odette would not depart St. Louis until November 5th. She would not arrive at Bellefontaine until November 18th. By then, everything would be over. Inside the locked bedchamber, meanwhile, through the final days of October and the first 2 weeks of November, Celestine was performing what she had been commanded to do. And it was something almost no one in the house understood, because almost no one in the house could have done it. She was forging her mistress's correspondence under Madame Honorine's direction, seated at the small writing desk beside the bed. Celestine was producing one after another the letters that would constitute the evidence of Odette's alleged refusal of support. There were 3 categories. First, copies of letters Madame Honorine claimed to have written to Odette during the previous winter, begging for remittances. These Celestine produced in an imitation of her mistress's own hand, which she had studied by watching Madame Honorine write for 2 years. Second, letters from Odette to Madame, replying with refusals or with silence. These were more challenging. Celestine had never seen Odette's hand. Madame had preserved, in the sealed leather portfolio her husband had left, 2 genuine letters Odette had written to her father many years before. Celestine had these before her. She studied them. She practiced on scraps of paper, and then she produced, in Odette's hand as best she could imitate it, replies that were curt, dismissive, and cruel. Third, and this was the most audacious of the 3, an affidavit in Odette's own hand, and over Odette's forged signature, allegedly written to a St. Louis notary, acknowledging that she had received her mother's requests and had decided not to respond. This document was intended to be discovered, much later, among Odette's papers, and to be produced against her in any legal challenge she might raise. It was the masterpiece of the forgery. It was also the document that, more than any other, reveals what kind of woman Madame Honorine Thibodeaux had become at the end of her life. Celestine composed these documents by candlelight, by oil lamp, by the gray morning light through the shuttered windows. She wrote slowly. She checked each letter against the genuine samples. She rewrote pages when her hand slipped or her imitation wavered. Madame Honorine observed her, correcting, insisting, demanding that the language be period appropriate, that the paper be aged with diluted coffee, that the ink be mixed with just enough iron gall to look old. When Celestine finished a document, Madame Honorine would take it in her trembling right hand, hold it close to her face, and read it. Sometimes she would nod, and Celestine would set it aside in the completed pile. Sometimes she would shake her head and hand it back, and Celestine would burn it in the small porcelain dish by the bed and begin again. The physical process of producing a convincing forgery in 1853 was more intricate than we might suppose. Paper, first of all, could not be obtained fresh and made to appear old. The grain of the paper itself, its weight, its rag content, its watermark, all had to match what would have been available in the year the letter was supposedly written. Madame Honorine had, for this purpose, a stack of blank sheets that she had been collecting for years from the backs of older correspondence, cutting the blank portions away, storing them in a locked drawer. She had sheets from 1852, 1851, 1850, each separated by ribbon and labeled. The ink had to match the period. Iron gall ink in the 1850s oxidized to a particular shade of brown over the course of months and years, and a freshly mixed batch could not reproduce that color without aging. Madame had prepared, also in advance, a small bottle of heavily oxidized ink, held back from her husband's correspondence after his death in '38, which she had diluted, and was now reserving for the most critical documents. The diluted coffee was used not on the whole page, but in small spots at the corners, simulating the natural foxing that old paper develops. The folds had to match the pattern a letter would have acquired from being folded into an envelope, carried in a saddlebag unfolded, refolded, stored in a drawer. Celestine learned to simulate all of this. She learned it in 3 days. The handwriting itself was the most difficult part. A person's hand is as distinctive as a voice, and it changes in subtle ways over the course of a lifetime. Madame Honorine's hand in 1853 was not the hand she had written with in 1843, and a forgery dated 10 years earlier had to reflect that older hand, which meant Celestine had to work not only from Madame's current handwriting, but from older samples Madame produced from the leather portfolio. Letters Madame had written to her husband in the 30s, to her mother in the 20s. Celestine had to learn 3 different versions of her mistress's hand, and to produce each one consistently. Odette's hand, which Celestine had only the 2 old letters to work from, was even more difficult. Odette, as a young woman, wrote with a rounder, more careful hand than she presumably used now. Celestine had to extrapolate. She had to imagine what that hand would have become 20 years later, under the pressure of a merchant's household in St. Louis, and produce it. Madame Honorine, observing her, understood after the first day that she had chosen correctly. Celestine's hand was superior to hers had ever been. Celestine's eye was more precise. Celestine's patience with the slow, exhausting work of letter by letter imitation was greater than Madame's own would have been at any point in her life. There were moments, in the gray light of the early afternoon, when Madame Honorine watched the young woman bent over the writing desk, her dark hair catching the light from the oil lamp, her fingers moving the pen in small, deliberate arcs, and felt something she had not felt since her son Pascal had died. It was a kind of astonishment. Astonishment that this person, who, by the laws she lived under, was property, was producing with her own hand a technical accomplishment that Madame herself could not have produced, that a notary would be unable to detect, that would stand up in a court of law and strip a Thibaudeau's daughter of her birthright. And it was astonishment, and it was gratitude, and it was a particular kind of hatred that comes from understanding that the hand one depends on is the hand one has tried to keep from existing. For the first 3 days, Celestine worked in silence. Madame Honorine spoke only to instruct. Celestine answered only in monosyllables. They ate separately. Madame from the tray Madame Voisin brought and which Celestine had to carry from the door to the bedside. Celestine from whatever was left after her mistress had finished. They did not speak to each other about what they were doing or why. But on the 4th day, something began to shift. And this is the part of the story that I had not anticipated when I first began to reconstruct it, and that alters its meaning entirely. Madame Honorine began to talk. Not to instruct, not to dictate. To talk about her life, about her sons, about Pascal who had died in the duel at 19, about the way Pascal had laughed, about the particular green color of his eyes, about her husband Leopold, whom she had loved and not loved, whom she had helped through 3 bad harvests in the 40s, whose gambling had nearly ruined them all, about her mother and her mother's mother, and the founding of Belle Fontaine by her grandfather Armand, who had come up the Mississippi from New Orleans as a boy and had cleared the first 100 arpents with his own hands and the hands of the 11 Senegambian men he had bought at the Charter Street Market in the spring of 1740. About Odette, about the way Odette, as a child, had been afraid of the storms that rolled in off the Gulf, and how Honorine had sat with her daughter through those storms, and how she, Honorine, had believed in those moments that she loved her daughter more than she had ever loved anyone. About how that love had curdled into something she could not name. About how she hated her daughter now. How her hatred was the only thing keeping her alive. How she knew with perfect clarity, that this hatred was evil, and that she was going to die in Virginia, and that she was going to take everything she had and throw it into the mouth of that hatred before she went. Celestine listened. She kept writing. Sometimes Madame Honorine would fall silent for long stretches and Celestine would work alone. The only sound in the room the scratch of the pen. Sometimes Madame would begin to weep, which was not like her, and Celestine would put down the pen and bring her water in the small silver cup. And sometimes Madame would reach out her trembling right hand and Celestine would take it. Not as a slave takes the hand of her mistress, but as one woman takes the hand of another in the middle of the night, and would hold it until Madame fell asleep. The room itself, during those 11 days, took on a particular quality. The shutters were closed during the daylight hours, because Madame could no longer tolerate bright light. The windows were cracked at night, to release the heat of the oil lamps, and the closeness of the 2 bodies in the confined space. The air smelled of the ink and of the coffee used to age the paper, and of the camphor Madame Voisin sent up for Madame's rheumatism, and of the particular sour, sweet smell of illness that settles over any sick room after the first week. Also, there was a large carved armoire against the wall opposite the bed, its doors closed, about which Madame had said nothing, and which Celestine did not open. There was a small oratory in the corner with a crucifix and a porcelain figure of the Virgin, before which Madame did not pray during those 11 days, which was itself a kind of statement. There was the writing desk, covered increasingly with papers in 3 separate piles, the completed forgeries, the rejected drafts awaiting burning, and the blank sheets waiting to be used. There was the bed, enormous, dark mahogany, carved with grapes and vines, in which Madame had been born 73 years earlier, and in which she would die 11 days hence. There was the daybed at the foot where Celestine slept. There was the porcelain basin on the stand by the window, where Celestine washed in cold water once a day. And there was, outside the locked door, the rest of the world, which did not know what was happening inside the room, and which, through Madame Voisin's careful management, was being kept from asking. On the 5th day, Madame asked Celestine to read aloud to her. Her eyes had grown too weak for sustained reading, and she wanted to hear the pages, a book of sermons by a 17th-century French bishop that she had kept on her bedside table for 40 years. Celestine, who had never been permitted to acknowledge her literacy to her mistress, hesitated. "And now," Madame said, without looking up, "we are past the point of pretending. So Celestine, read." Her French was careful, her pronunciation formal, her voice lower than the housekeeper had ever heard her speak. Madame listened with her eyes closed. When Celestine finished a passage, Madame would sometimes comment, sometimes correct the pronunciation of an archaic word, sometimes simply ask her to go on. For an hour each afternoon, for the remaining 6 days, they did this. A woman who had owned another woman for that other woman's entire life, listening to her read from a book of Catholic sermons about mercy in the gray light of a shuttered room, in which they were jointly manufacturing evidence of a crime that had not been committed against a woman neither of them had seen in a decade. On the 6th day, Madame asked Celestine whether her mother Philomene had been happy. Celestine put down the pen. She considered the question for a long time. She said at last that she did not know whether her mother had been happy. She said that her mother had loved her. She said that her mother had taught her to read in a corner of the kitchen on Sunday afternoons when the family was at Mass, using a stick to trace letters in the flour, dusted surface of the worktable, so that no written evidence would survive. She said that her mother had told her many times that learning was the one thing that could not be taken away once it was in the head. She said her mother had been proud of her. She did not say whether she herself had been happy. Madame did not ask. On the 7th day, Madame asked Celestine what she wanted, not as an instruction, not rhetorically, as a question. What did Celestine personally desire from her life, if she could of anything? Celestine did not answer for a long time. Then she said, in a voice so quiet Madame had to lean forward to hear it, that she wanted to live somewhere, where no one could knock on a door and take her away. That was all she said. Madame did not respond. She closed her eyes, and she did not open them again for 2 hours. On the 8th day, Madame Honorine asked Celestine a question. She asked it without looking up. She asked in French whether Celestine had loved her own mother, Philomene. Celestine answered that she had. Madame asked whether Celestine thought Philomene had loved her. Celestine answered that she had. Madame was silent for a long time. Then she said, in a voice so thin it was almost breath, that she wished she had allowed the doctor to come to Philomene in the winter of '51. She did not apologize. She did not ask for forgiveness. She simply uttered the sentence in the flat way. She might have said that it was going to rain. And then she went back to dictating the next letter. On the 10th day, Celestine did something that she had not been instructed to do, that she had not planned, that she had not, as far as I can tell from what survives, even fully understood she was doing until the moment was past. She switched. She was writing at that moment the third and most dangerous of the forgeries. The affidavit in Odette's hand, over Odette's forged signature acknowledging refusal to support her mother. She had been working on it for a day and a half. Madame Honorine, exhausted, had dozed off at around 3 in the afternoon. Her head fallen forward on her chest, her breath ragged. Celestine looked at her sleeping mistress. She looked down at the document she was producing, and instead of continuing in the hand of Odette, producing Odette's false confession, she began very quietly to write something else. She wrote in her own hand on a fresh sheet of paper the truth. She wrote that she, Celestine, property of Madame Honorine Thibodeaux of Bellefontaine Plantation in the parish of Iberville, Louisiana, aged approximately 26 years, being instructed by her mistress to produce forged correspondence intended to establish false grounds for the disinheritance of Madame Odette Caylux of St. Louis, did hereby state, under such oath as a person in her condition could give, that the said correspondence was forged by her own hand under duress, under her mistress's dictation, in the locked bedchamber of Madame Thibodeaux over the course of the preceding days. She listed the specific documents she had produced. She described the methods used to age them. She named the persons who had entered the bedchamber, the notary Delacroix, and the date. She named herself. She signed it. She had been taught to read and write by her mother, Philoménie. Her mother, Philoménie, had been taught by a previous mistress at a plantation near Point Coupé decades before, and had carried the skill in secret through her life, and had passed it in secret to her daughter. And now, in a locked room in the autumn of '53, that secret literacy, smuggled through 2 generations of enslaved women, was being used to produce the only honest document in the entire affair. Celestine folded the paper. She hid it in the lining of her apron, between the inner and outer layers, where she had slit the seam 2 days before for exactly this purpose. She returned to the forgery. She completed it in Odette's hand. She set it on top of the pile. On the morning of November 14th, Madame Honorine did not wake up. Just as the horror in this Louisiana plantation house reaches its darkest hour, I want to ask you something. If what you are hearing tonight is gripping you the way it gripped me when I first uncovered these documents, please share this video with a friend who loves dark American history. Hit the like button to signal to the algorithm that stories like this matter, and subscribe if you have not already. Because in our next investigation, we are traveling to the Pine Barrens of New Jersey to uncover a story of institutional corruption that has been buried for 170 years. Let us discover together what occurred in the last hours at Bellefontaine. Celestine found her mistress at about 6 in the morning. She had fallen asleep on the small daybed at the foot of Madame's own bed, as she had every night for 11 nights. When she woke, she immediately perceived the absence. The sound of Madame's labored breathing, which had filled the room every night, was gone. She rose. She crossed to the bed. She placed her hand on Madame's cheek. It was cool. She stood there for a long time in the gray light. Then she did the only thing she knew to do. She opened the door. Madame Voisin, who had heard the door open, came at once from the other end of the corridor. She entered the bedchamber. She saw her mistress dead in the bed. She saw Celestine standing by the writing desk with her hands at her sides. She saw on the desk the completed pile of documents, and she understood in one long moment of looking from the papers to Celestine, to Madame's body, and back, and a great deal of what had occurred in that room. She was a practical woman. She had served the Thibodeaux family for 51 years. She did 3 things in the next hour. First, she closed the bedchamber door and locked it again, this time with Celestine inside. Second, she went downstairs and woke the overseer, Bertrand Sickard, telling him that Madame had passed in the night and that the bedchamber must remain sealed until the notary could be summoned. Third, she sent the stable boy with a message. not to Arseny, who was sleeping off the previous night's brandy, and not to the notary Delacroix in Donaldsonville, but to the parish priest at the Catholic church 3 miles away, with a whispered instruction that the priest should come not to perform last rites, which were now too late, but to witness. When the priest arrived at 8 in the morning, Madame Voisin took him directly upstairs. She unlocked the bedchamber door. She entered with the priest and with Celestine alone. And there, in the presence of the dead woman and the young slave and the old free Creole housekeeper, the priest, Father Etienne Rouillet, 44 years old, Breton by origin, who had been at Donaldsonville for 6 years, heard from Celestine's own lips what had happened over the preceding 11 days. Celestine told him everything. She produced from the lining of her apron the statement she had written in her own hand on the 10th day. She gave it to him. She told him that she did not know what would happen to her now, but that she wanted the truth to exist somewhere in the world outside this room, where her mistress could no longer reach it. The priest read the statement. He read it twice. Then he did something that I believe saved Celestine's life, though it cost him his position in the diocese within the year. He took the statement. He folded it. He placed it in the inner pocket of his cassock. Then he turned to Madame Voisin and he said, in French, a single sentence. The sentence, recorded later in Madame Voisin's Freedman's Bureau testimony of 67, was this: "We will say," he said, "that Madame was alone." They went back downstairs. They encountered Bertrand Sicard and Arseny, who had now been awakened, and they told them that Madame had died in the night, alone, having dismissed her maid the evening before. Celestine was sent back to the laundry quarters. The bedchamber was opened to the family. The pile of documents on the writing desk was gathered up by Arseny, who knew immediately what they were, and who, in a moment of decision that I believe was the only honorable act of his adult life, said nothing to anyone about the fact that the ink on several of them was still less than 3 days dry. Arseny, you see, had also understood something in the last 2 weeks. He had understood that if those documents reached the notary Delacroix, and if they were entered into the record, and if Odette were in fact disinherited by authentic Act of Article 1521, then a vast new legal dispute would open up. The diocese would challenge the document. Odette and her husband, Hyacinthe Cailloux, would contest it in the courts. The handwriting would be examined by experts in New Orleans. The forgeries might or might not be detected. The case might continue for a decade. And even if Arseny and the diocese prevailed, Arseny's share would be consumed by lawyers. Whereas, if Madame died without executing the New Testament, the existing one, which gave the disposable quarter to the diocese and the forced 3 quarters to Odette, would stand. Arseny would inherit nothing under the old will. But, and this was the crucial point, under Louisiana law, as Arseny knew, if Odette died without children, which she had so far not produced, Arseny would be next in line as Madame's nearest collateral relative, and Odette was 41 years old, sickly and childless, and there was in 1853 no reliable treatment for the condition. Arseny had been quietly told by the family physician in St. Louis, through a mutual acquaintance, that his cousin was suffering from. Arseny burned the documents that evening, all of them. He burned them in the fireplace of Madame's own bedchamber, including, had he noticed it, the sheet of paper in Celestine's own hand that Father Rouillet had already taken away. Odette arrived at Bellefontaine on November 18th. She was met at the front gallery by Arseny and by the notary Delacroix, who had been summoned for the reading of the will. The will was read. It was the old will, the one that gave her the forced 3 quarters and the diocese the disposable quarter. Odette wept. not for her mother, but from the release of 10 years of dread over what her mother might have done. Hyacinth Caylux, her husband, took possession of the estate on her behalf within the week. Ars Ni Pontalba was given $2,000 and his horse and told, civilly, that he was no longer welcome at Bellefontaine. He returned to New Orleans. He died 4 years later of typhus in a boarding house near the French Market. And he was not missed. Odette lived for another 11 years. She never had children. She died of the condition her mother had known about and had not named. A cancer of the breast. In St. Louis in the summer of '64, while her husband's commission firm was being ruined by the Union blockade of the lower Mississippi. Bellefontaine passed, in accordance with her will, to her husband, Hyacinth, who sold it in 1869 to a northern consortium. The house was used as a rice mill for 30 years. It burned in 1902. The foundations can still be seen in a cleared field, 2 miles off the river road, by anyone who knows where to look. Father E. Tyne Rouillet left the parish of Donaldsonville in the spring of 1854 under what the diocesan records describe as a disagreement with his bishop. He went north. He served a small mission parish in Illinois for 20 years. He died in 1876. Among his papers, when they were sent back to the diocesan archive in New Orleans, after his death, was an envelope marked in French with a single phrase, "The truth from Bellefontaine." Inside were 3 sheets of paper. 2 were his own notes made after the events of November 14th. The third was Celestine's statement in her own hand. That envelope sat in the diocesan archive unfiled and uncatalogued for 97 years. It was discovered in 1973 by a graduate student working on a dissertation about Louisiana succession law. But the student did not understand what he had found. He photocopied the documents and returned the originals to the folder. The photocopies went into his research file. The research file, after he abandoned the dissertation and left academia, was donated in 2008 to a small historical society in Baton Rouge. It sat in a box for 11 more years. I found it in the autumn of 2019 by accident, while looking for something else. As for Celestine, Madame Voisin in her Freedmen's Bureau testimony of 67 states that Celestine remained at Bellefontaine under Hyacinth Caylux's ownership for 7 more years, working as a seamstress in the household, never speaking of what had occurred in the locked room. In the summer of 1861, when Louisiana seceded and Hyacinth began to fear that his property north and south would be disputed by both sides of the coming war, he executed in New Orleans an act of emancipation for 11 of his wife's inherited slaves, including Celestine. The act survives. It is on file at the Louisiana State Archives. Celestine's emancipation was unconditional. She received with it a sum of $180 in silver and a letter of introduction to a free Creole family in New Orleans with whom she could take shelter. She used the money and the letter. She went to New Orleans. She worked as a seamstress in the Faubourg Marigny through the war. She married in 1868 a free man of color named Jean-Baptiste Lafleur, who worked as a clerk for a cotton factor on Canal Street. They had 2 children. She lived until 1891. She is buried in St. Louis Cemetery, No. 2 in New Orleans, in a small above-ground tomb that still stands. Though the name on the marble has almost weathered away, she never, as far as the surviving record shows, spoke of what happened in the locked bedchamber at Bellefontaine in the autumn of '53. Not to her husband, not to her children, not to the Freedmen's Bureau. She left behind no diary, no memoir, no letters of her own. The only document we have in her voice is the one she wrote at the small writing desk on the 10th day with her mistress sleeping beside her, which survived because a Breton priest in Illinois kept it in an envelope in his desk for 22 years, and which tells us in one single page in a careful and practiced hand, what she did and why she did it. She did not free herself. She could not. The forgeries she produced for her mistress were destroyed with her mistress's death, before they could do any damage. And her own honest statement was preserved by chance and conscience in places she never knew. The crime she was ordered to commit was never executed. The daughter was not disinherited. The plantation did not pass to the nephew. Everything her mistress tried to do in those 11 days was undone by her own death before it could take effect. And Celestine's single honest document, which would have blown the forgeries apart had they ever been presented to a court, sat undisturbed for almost 170 years. But consider what she did. In a society that denied her every form of legal personhood, she produced, from inside a locked room, in which she was held as an instrument of her mistress's hatred, a document that asserted her own existence as a moral witness. She described what she was doing. She refused to allow the record of it to rest only in the hands of the woman who had compelled it. She carried it out of the room in the lining of her apron. She placed it in the hands of the one free person she thought might preserve it. And she returned to her work in the laundry and said nothing and waited. The horror of Belle Fontaine is not that a cruel old woman tried to disinherit her daughter. Cruel old women have been trying to disinherit their daughters for as long as there have been inheritances. The horror is the machinery. The horror is the idea that the entire weight of 113 years of a family's accumulated wealth, the land, the labor, the blood, the silence, could rest in its final hour on whether a 26-year-old woman who was not even considered a legal person would choose to use the hand her mother had secretly trained to produce a lie or to produce the truth. And it rested there because, and only because, the laws of that society had made her invisible. A person cannot be a witness, but Celestine was not a person under the Code Civil of 1825. She was a thing. Things do not testify. Things cannot lie in court. Things, in the cold logic of the Louisiana planters, were the perfect instrument of fraud, because no forgery produced by a thing could ever be traced back to a human author who might be called into a courtroom to confess. Madame Honorine Thibodeaux understood this perfectly. It was why she chose Celestine. It was why she locked the door. It was why she believed, as she dictated her lies in the gray October light, that she had solved the problem of her forced hair daughter once and for all by simply reaching for the one witness in her household who could never be a witness. She was wrong, not because the law changed. The law did not change, not because Celestine was discovered, because she was not. Madame was wrong because Celestine, whose mother's name was Philomene and whose grandmother's name we do not know, had learned something in secret generations deep that Madame had never imagined. She had learned that the hand can testify even when the voice cannot. She had learned that paper outlives everything. She had learned that there are ways of speaking that do not require permission. They can be folded into the lining of an apron. They can be carried out of a locked room and placed in the palm of a priest. She had learned, in other words, that she was a person. And she had known it all 11 days, while her mistress sat beside her dictating the fiction that she was not. This mystery of Belle Fontaine reveals something we do not wish to see about how American wealth was built in the old French parishes of Louisiana. It reveals that the machinery of inheritance, the forms of law, the careful legitimations of property passing from one generation to the next, depended at their deepest and most intimate level on the compelled complicity of the people that same law refused to recognize as human. It reveals that a single locked bedchamber could contain at the same moment the full ugliness of that system and a quiet private act of human dignity that the system was not designed to permit and could not fully erase. Celestine's statement exists. I have seen it. It is 12 inches by 8 inches. It is written in careful French in a hand that was never meant to have been trained. It ends with her signature, a single word, the only name she ever gave herself on paper in her entire life. And that signature, in the autumn of '53. In a locked room on a decaying sugar plantation in the parish of Iberville, is louder than every forged letter her mistress ever made her write. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that every corner of it has been revealed? Or do you think there are pieces still buried in the archives of Louisiana and the old diocesan records that might someday tell us more about Celestine, about Father Rouilly, about Madame Voisin, about who else might have known? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one. If this story has stayed with you tonight, subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves dark American history. I will see you in the next investigation. Until then, keep listening for the voices the record was not designed to preserve. They are there. You only have to know how to find them.